So recently there were protests in Cuba. They got a lot of coverage in the United States. There were support protests in favor of the protesters in Cuba in some cities in Florida. I believe there was I think the largest one was in Miami. There's a large Cuban population there. And then shortly afterwards, there were a bunch of counter-protests, or what was called pro-revolutionary protests, that took place, more or less in defense of and in support of the government. And the takes that were given by individuals and by media figures was kind of an interesting grab bag of nonsense. Obviously, they're not all wrong, and I think someone did make good points, but I want to give you my perspective on this, and I just kind of want to dispel the notion that all of this is being cultivated by one thing, and I want to give you kind of the other side of it too, why the dynamics have changed recently and things like that. So let's step back a couple of weeks ago, shall we, for when these protests were first starting. Originally, they were now, mind you, Cuba obviously has been a state enemy of the United States for a very long time. The United States has an economic embargo against Cuba. The United States maintains that embargo to this day. They work with other nations to maintain the embargo, and they punish nations who violate the embargo. So, this more or less is an embargo that not only extends from the United States, but also all of its allies and all the other nation states for whom the United States bears some level of influence, right? So just a little bit of context there. The United States has attempted to overthrow the communist government of Cuba multiple times. The most disastrous of these was the Bay of Pigs invasion. I think Fidel Castro's life was threatened something like 600 times by various intelligence forces tied to or allied with the United States. And, there was just kind of all this stuff going on. So originally, there was a democratically elected individual whose name I'm blanking on, who was running Cuba. The United States did not like them. So the United States overthrew them and installed Batista, who was a U.S.-friendly dictator that ruled with an iron fist. And then the Communist Revolution came, and Fidel Castro led his band of guerrillas to take over guerrilla fighters, not like apes, but like people who hide in bushes and stuff. Guerrilla fighters to take over the country, and then they began a program of nationalizing large numbers of resources, and taking land away from the rich and ostensibly giving it to the poor or giving it to the government. Okay, there have been issues with that. There have been places where land has been taken and it was not redistributed. There are places where government officials have made lots of personal wealth, right? So the system obviously wasn't executed perfectly, but this is more or less what was happening there as they went forward. And because of this ostensible alignment with the communist ideology during the Cold War, when the United States was fighting for capitalism in the world, there was a large amount of frustration and animosity between the United States and Cuba, not least because of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, which made the United States very nervous because there was a threat of nuclear weapons being stored in Cuba on behalf of the Soviet Union. So there's a lot going on here. But so we're going to fast forward a little bit to a couple weeks ago when these protests started to erupt in Cuba. Now, primarily, these protests have been about food, about medicine. There's been lots of problems in Cuba recently about the distribution of food and medicine, with concerns that not enough food and medicine is coming into the country. This is especially problematic because there's a pandemic going on, as you all know. So, there were lots of protests going on, and these protests eventually started to become anti-government protests, which, by the way, makes perfect sense, right? If you are in a situation where, your basic needs are not being met, you are going to protest the people in power because, in theory, and in most cases, they have the ability to kind of alleviate that burden on you in some way, shape, or form. And so it makes perfect sense for the protests to become anti-government protests, to say, hey, I'm mad at the government because I can't eat and I can't get medicine. Now, the way it was reported on in the United States is that these were pro-capitalist, anti-communist, protesters, and the Biden administration stands with them, and the Cuban people are making their decision, and they're showing that communism doesn't work. And there was a whole bunch of capitalist propaganda that was used to report on these. And mind you, some of the root causes of it, you can say, come from communism if you want. I don't think that's true, and I think I've laid out why you can't necessarily tie together the ideology and the government, right? If the government poorly executes the ideology, it's hard to say the ideology is to blame. I think that's the case in all countries, right? But I digress. So shortly after these protests were going on, I think about 2 weeks later, the government called on its supporters and said, hey, we see these people in the streets, they're getting lots of press coverage. Could you all please go in the streets and, show that you support the government? Can you do pro-government protests? And so there were lots of demonstrators came, and they waved Cuban flags, and they sang songs of the revolution, and they were very much in favor of the revolution. These protests didn't get as much coverage. However, something else, another dynamic started to go forward, which was the anti-government protests started to die down. Now, that didn't get a ton of coverage either, but what did get a ton of coverage, and justifiably so, was the fact that the government was starting to crack down on these protests, ostensibly because they didn't like the coverage they were getting. So they used the military to crack down a little bit on these anti-government protests. And by the way, don't do that. It's a terrible idea. And typically it only makes protests worse. But in this case, it did seem to make these protesters go away. Now, that being said, I am sure that the grievances that they were feeling and originally having to do with food and medicine still exist. So if you happen to be the Cuban government and you're watching this, even if those people are not ideologically aligned with you, you should help them because they're in your country and they are your responsibility whether you like them or not. By the way, that's the same way in every country. Regardless of how you feel about your government or the regime or the ideology to which it ascribes, you should be aware that we are operating as national units for the most part, and we need to make sure that as long as we continue to operate in these national units and use this method of resource collection and distribution, you are then responsible for all of the individuals in your care. So if you're the communist government of Cuba and you don't like the capitalist protesters, that's fine. You don't have to like them. You do have to make sure they have access to food. You do have to make sure they have access to medicine. And you do need to not use your military against them because that makes you look like authoritarian thugs, like any country looks when it uses its military against its own people, whether that is capitalist, communist, feudal, whatever, right? Just it's not good. So don't do that. But I think the point of all this is to say, and I've given you a decent chunk of timeline here. I've given you a lot of events that have gone on. I've given all the context that I can give essentially here. And what I'll say at the end of the day is, it is perfectly rational to report on protests, right? It gets clicks, it gets views. Media typically moves towards confrontational things because it's exciting, right? It gets people, it gets eyeballs, and a lot of news is ratings driven nowadays, so it totally makes sense. I'm not criticizing the coverage of the protest whatsoever, but you need to look at it from a grander perspective. Why isn't there food and medicine in Cuba? Well, it probably has to do in no small part to the fact that many countries are not able to give food to Cuba, are not able to give medicine to Cuba, and are not allowed to trade with Cuba, right? So Cuba is trying to maintain itself on whatever resources it can create on its own, and do so without being reliant on any other governments, because most governments are not going to have the ability to get around US and allied sanctions. So we're dealing with a country that primarily is trying to fend for itself, to generate its food and medicine on its own. And mind you, it has typically done a good job of that. But like all situations, it falls on hard times. You can get a bad crop. Some medicine can spoil. There are small little disasters that can happen, which can have large consequences if you don't have some level of reserves or if you don't have the ability to import reserves from other countries. And Cuba does not have this ability. So if it was a natural disaster or it was a man-made disaster that caused for food and medicine to be in less supply than usual, it makes sense for people to protest. But the context that has to be given for these protests is that part of the reason that the food and medicine is not available is because it cannot be brought in from other countries. And it cannot be brought in from other countries because the United States and its allies have a trade embargo on Cuba and have had for the last 60 years. We made some great progress under the Obama administration, who tried to resolve their quandary with Cuba and allow Cuba to trade with the US and for people to go there and what have you, to send money back and such. Trump undid all of that. And by the way, he shouldn't have. We should go back to peaceable relations with Cuba and allow them to, have access to food and medicine. And look, at the end of the day, if we get to a point where Cuba, on its own, without American help or influence, or without help and influence from other countries, decides to shift back from a communist model of government, of economic exchange, to a capitalist model of economic exchange, then okay, so be it, right? And capitalists can say it was a communist experiment that failed, and there are lots of, there are lots of people who are going to be able to tut about it. Fine, you can win about that. I don't really care. But the thing is, the point is to allow the Cuban people to do this on their own, to not be influenced by the United States or by economic impositions that are put on by the United States and its allies. The Cuban people have the right, just like any other people around the world, to make decisions for themselves. And if you're reporting on this protest and on these protests against the government as if the only people who are stopping the Cubans from making their own decisions is the government of that country, you're engaging in journalistic malpractice and you don't know what you're talking about. There are lots of contextual clues and important information that you can give in order to show the true context of what's going on there. And if you don't do that, you're merely playing for an ideological team. In this segment, I tried to give you all the information I possibly could that I'm aware of that is going on. I gave you my perspective, and I hope that you take that to inform your perspective. I had to say things that weren't exactly in line with my ideology. And you know what? That's fine. But I told you the facts as I knew them, and I gave you my perspective, which honestly is, the best thing that I can do to give you as objective to be open, not objective, but to be open and honest and transparent about who I am, where I'm coming from, and what the information is. So I hope that, we get better media coverage for things like this in the future. I'm not necessarily confident in that, but I did just want to take some time to talk about the protests in Cuba, to talk about what the root causes of those are, and to give you a sense of, what can be done to, make this situation better, which is first, foremost, primary, and maybe only to lift the embargo.